Hello and welcome to another episode of Stories of Hope by Kangaroo Minds. I'm Vedika, and today we have with us Steve Phillip. Steve is a mental health advocate and the founder of the Jordan Legacy, named in honor of his son Jordan. Steve was a successful leadership and sales coach and a corporate speaker until December 2019, when he received a call that would change his life forever. Steve was then informed that his young son, Jordan, had taken his own life. Since then, Steve has set up the Jordan Legacy to help provide hope to those who are feeling suicidal, and by engaging like-minded individuals to help move towards a zero suicide society. Steve delivers several impactful talks using his own lived experience and insights to help others spot the signs of suicide, look after their mental health, and help provide support to those who might be feeling suicidal. Before we begin to hear more from Steve about his lived experience and his work, we would like to put out a trigger warning for our audiences. If at any point during this conversation, should you find yourself feeling triggered or distressed, we urge you to take a step back and look after yourself. Should you need any additional support resources, you can also find them on our website. And now, without taking up much time, I'm going to hand over to Steve. Steve, it's so lovely to have you with us today. Thank you for taking out some time to join us.
Vedika, thank you for inviting me to speak with you and all your followers as well. It's very much appreciated. It's a story you've introduced very well. Thank you for that I share a lot. This is a very busy period, this particular time of year, of course, as we look at World Mental Health Month and World Suicide Prevention Month. And so it's a conversation I have very often, and as you say, it started really for me in December of 2019, and we're coming up to now the fifth anniversary of Jordan's suicide. He was 34 years old when he took his own life in a loving relationship with his partner, and unfortunately, she was the young lady that found Jordan that day on December the 4th. And through the talks I deliver, we talk a lot about statistics and numbers of suicide. But as we were just saying before we came on air, behind every death by suicide, of course, is a life that had potential. And Jordan was, he was a good-looking young man by many people's estimation, 34 years old, 6 foot plus tall, in this loving relationship. He had a loving, supportive family, despite his mother and I having separated and divorced in 2005. We keep very close. In fact, she is best friends with Jordan's stepmom, my wife now of 10 years. And Jordan's sister works closely with us at the Jordan Legacy and supports me in all the work that we do. But he had a great job as well. He was an officer with the Independent Office for Police Conduct, who looks into police complaints in the UK. He had his own house. He had a huge network of friends that admired and looked up to him. And Jordan was the person they would often go to if they were struggling. So I think it's important to start the conversation by saying we're talking about a life, that was very much loved by many people, that had the potential to go on and do great things. And now, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way we look at this, his legacy is now helping other people going forward.
I think, Steve, it's remarkable, the way you have worked tirelessly to keep Jordan's legacy alive, not just in terms of telling his story and, sort of humanizing him as a person beyond the fact that, he did end his own life, but also the way that you use that to help other people who might be struggling.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me because in the weeks and months following Jordan's death, you question everything about your own life, of course. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I'd had a successful career in consultancy, and that all came to a stop literally that day. In the weeks and months following Jordan's suicide, we're now into early 2020, and of course the international pandemic, global pandemic of COVID-19 So many people's lives stopped at that time, and in a strange kind of way, that allowed me time to step back and look at what I was going to do. Very early on, in January of 2020, I published an article on LinkedIn that had a huge viral response, global response. Um, and that article was titled "The Day My Son Took His Own Life." And it was my way of, because I knew no one else that had been through this. I couldn't think of anyone who'd lost someone to suicide. The article was a way of explaining what was happening to us as a family, and also maybe indirectly asking the question, is anyone else going through this? Um, but also to say, this is the awful mess that's been left behind. If you are thinking of doing anything similar, just be aware this might be what you leave, which is quite a naive thinking process. Now I recognize that, but it did have that effect. I had hundreds and thousands of people reach out
Mm.
globally, some of who were considering ending their own lives and said, I've read your article. I just can't do this to my family or my loved ones. But then I started to get lots of responses from people who had been bereaved by suicide, who were working in suicide prevention, and just people touched by the article. And I think what happened, Vidika, at that moment was I kind of knew that I wasn't going to do what I'd done for the last 30 years anymore, and that I had to learn more about this subject and find a way to make a difference. I'm not unusual in making that kind of decision following such a loss, but that was really where the journey started for me.
No, I think that's really interesting, when you talk about what it was like and, to sort of reach out to people and sort of share your story, because I know a lot of times when we talk about suicide and we talk about suicide loss, I think we forget to talk about support for those left behind. And I'm sure, Steve, you're also aware of the statistic that, about each suicide that takes place affects about 135 people. So whether it's family, friends, coroners, first responders, community, and of course, those who are bereaved by suicide are themselves at a 63% higher risk of suicide themselves. So when we talk about supporting survivors of suicide loss. And maybe we can come to this a little bit later, but what has that been like for you personally? Because you did touch upon how hard it was. And, I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it is to be, on the receiving end of that phone call and, hear that, your son has ended his own life and also having to share the news with other family members. So what was it like for you in terms of your mental health and, what has sort of helped you through that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. As I say, we had no idea where you turn for support in such situations. We received very little support initially, certainly not from the police. There was no liaison. I've told this story before, how, the police officer that was on the scene supporting Charlotte, Jordan's girlfriend and partner, called me as I was driving back from a business appointment I was at, some 3.5 hours away. And her first question to me was, do you have a funeral director? As I'm driving on the fast lane of the motorway to get home. That officer was our only point of contact. She then went on leave for 7 days, barely responding to any messages. And I spent the first 24 hours driving around police stations in this part of the UK we live in West Yorkshire, to find where they'd taken Jordan. I mean, there was nothing at all. So at that time, we were having contact with the coroner's office, and a lot of this is, still very confusing in my head, of course. It was only gradually that we were made aware of support organisations, that could help us. So really, I had to just get on and be that kind of support lead for our family. We created our own WhatsApp group to help each other, um, and kind of make our way through the journey, if you like. Now, we were all struggling to sleep. We saw the doctor for medication to help us with that. I now recognized that I was suffering with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, never diagnosed. Um, And although I visited the doctor, who provided some sleeping medication for me, when he asked me, so how are you coping with all this? And I said, well, I'm making all the arrangements that need to be arranged for the family and the funerals. We've actually booked a bit of family time away to go to a cottage and a retreat, all the family, including Jordan's girlfriend and his grandmother and everybody. And his response was, "Okay, well, you seem to be doing remarkably well." And I thought, okay, well, I must be doing okay. And it was kind of that conversation. We just got on with it. And I have had really not attended really any formal counseling or therapy during that time. But I think what has helped for me particularly was having the conversations very quickly online following that article, sharing the story, and starting to meet other people impacted by suicide, some bereaved and some involved in this space, and just continuing to do that, which some people might describe as a distraction technique, or approach, but it has helped. It has helped me by talking continuously about the subject. It does lessen that acute pain for sure, even though the sadness is still there and you kind of understand what's happened. But for me, I think having that focus was really, really important for me.
No, I think that's really interesting, because the kind of responses that came your way, whether it was from, the police officer or even, the medical practitioner, saying that you were doing remarkably well, somewhere it also tells us how little we understand about suicide and suicide loss and sort of how to respond to people who are struggling. And I know you've been in this space for a while, and I mean, we're so thankful for people like you who share your story, but also for all the work that you are doing to help people feel, a little more supported and a little less alone in what they might be experiencing,
Mhm.
whether it's struggling with suicidal ideation or whether it's coping with suicide loss. But if you had to somewhere share some tips for someone who has been a suicide loss survivor, whether it's in terms of self-care and looking after themselves, is there anything that you found helpful?
Yes, I think it's grief is going to be different for everybody, how they experience it, the closeness of the relationship with the individual. There are many factors that mean our grief is going to be individual to us. But there are some commonalities because I'm often asked by people who have reached out to me who've lost someone to suicide, how do we move on? How do we move forward? How do I deal with this? And I can't give advice for their specific circumstances because I don't know them well enough and I'm not qualified to do that either. But I think for me, I continually say to people, it's about finding a sense of purpose. Um, and that sense of purpose might be really simple. You don't need to go and start a charity. You don't need to go and start speaking or writing articles or doing this. But if you can find, if that sense of purpose for you is that I've been in bed now for the last few weeks, but I've heard this from people, I just can't get out of bed. Um, get up and go to the bathroom. Get up, go downstairs, make your own breakfast. Just go out into the garden. Just go for a walk. Go and meet someone. Whatever it might be for you. Just having something step by step to focus on is really important because if you don't, this will consume you. It will completely debilitate you so you can't move forward. So I think the most common advice from experience of speaking to many other people as well is just find something
Mm.
that allows you to take that next step and that next step and that next step forward. So I think that's one of the first things I would say.
No, I think you're right. Sometimes it's just about starting, whether it's just the littlest things, if it's in terms of hygiene, whether it's about getting out of bed, whether it's making your own bed, whether it's about, just going for a walk. I think just sort of helping to break yourself out of that cycle of feeling that sense of despair can help a lot for people to kind of resume a normal life and move forward with their grief. Because I think a lot of times we're expected to just move on from grief. And when you lose someone so close to you, and as even you spoke about, I think the pain somewhere reduces over time, but the grief sort of lingers on.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And even the term moving on is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because you don't move on. I mean, you will never move on in the sense that most people would use that terminology, if you like. But it is possible to move forward. We hear terms used such as, time is a healer. No, it's not really. You will never heal. But I remember one of Jordan's close friends in the very early days who lost his young partner. They were only 30 at the time, and she died from a brain tumor. And a young mother, they had a young daughter, really difficult time. So he's had his experience of grief. And although I've seen this image many times since, shared by different people, he just shared this kind of image of grief as this object, if you like, that never shrinks. It never gets smaller. But but what we have the capacity to do is to grow around it. So in that sense, over time, the pain can become easier because we learn to grow around it. But the grief will never, it'll always be there, and it will always be the same size that it is. It's our capacity as human beings to grow around that is important to understand and recognize.
No, I think absolutely, and for people to understand that really helps them hold space for how they're feeling while also holding space for others. And, since we're talking about holding space and understanding what it's like, what would be some tips that you would want to share with people from your own experiences, from your interactions, when it comes to supporting somebody who has, lost someone to suicide?
Yes, I've been attending a number of talks and events recently talking on this very specific subject. So I can share from our own experience and also from other conversations that we have as well. And I think we recognize that with suicide death particularly, there is still a huge amount of stigma. We know within different cultures globally, you'll experience this, particularly with your own culture as well, that the stigma around suicide is different. Um, but there is a stigma in every element of society, and some of that has to do with the religious beliefs around suicide as a cardinal sin. It has to do with the illegality of attempting to take your own life, which was only decriminalized in the UK in 1961, so not that far ago. So we know that talking about suicide can be very difficult for someone who's been bereaved by suicide, the perceptions that they believe other people will have. Um, so one of the most important things we need to do is to be supportive, but to talk as openly as we can do, um, without judgment at all when we speak to somebody. But just coming back to the point of supporting someone, many people I know who've lost loved ones to suicide talk about how people avoid them because they don't know what to say. And I think sometimes people feel embarrassed or awkward because they feel they should be able to go in and fix and help that person. And actually, what that person doesn't necessarily expect or even want is for you to go in and fix them. So I think there are two important things you can do. One, be a really good friend and a listener. Don't go in talking, don't go in sharing your experiences that your cat died once and that was awful. And, so I understand how, but using language such as, I understand how awful this must be and how difficult this must be. Because saying things like, I can't imagine how you're feeling doesn't help actually, because it's not showing empathy. And empathy is putting yourself in the position of that person rather than sympathy. So saying things like, I understand how awful this must be for you and how difficult this must be for you. Um, and offering help as well, really practical help sometimes can be really important. So people, for instance, will say, "Oh God, I'm really sorry for your loss. You know, just reach out to me if you need any help," and then they'll disappear.
Mm.
And they're hoping you never get in touch, by the way, sometimes. But I think by being more proactive and saying, what can I do for you? I want to help in any way. What is it I can do for you? Can I walk the dog? Can I pick the children up from school? Can I get you some shopping? Just what we want at that time is practical help, and support. We don't asking us how, just give me a call sometime. We're not going to do that. We're just trying to deal with the most traumatic, awful experience of our lives here. But if you can come in and offer some really practical help, or just be there as a good listener, just hold that space. Sometimes that is just enough as well. And the listening is probably the most important thing you can do for people.
No, I think those are really interesting tips that you shared, because a lot of times, as you said, we don't know how to support someone. We don't want to talk about it. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of our own core beliefs, our sort of frame of reference starts to play into it because, after all, people don't know how to park their judgment aside most of the time because somewhere we're almost raised in a society which believes that suicide is cowardice, suicide is wrong, suicide is a way of giving up, but sometimes we don't realize the pain an individual might be experiencing, that they feel that the only way out is to take their own life. But
Mhm.
coming back to the whole support element, I think even the aspect of practically offering help, whether it's being like, would you like to go for a walk together? Or can I help you with some groceries? Can I help bring something in? Can I help you with dinner? I think that also takes a lot of load off of the people who are grieving and just sort of helps them feel that, it's okay. I can, like, it gives them time to process their feelings without having to worry about,
Yeah,
all kinds of different things.
yeah, I totally, absolutely agree.
And of course, the active listening piece, I think it's so important to be empathetic, to hold space, to let people know that you are sort of a safe space for them to talk to as and when they do want to talk about it. But
And active listening is a really important skill to, sometimes we all need to learn in life. And a lot of people may not know, well, what is active listening? And uh, yes, it's listening and hearing the words, but it's also how you respond and react, and maybe just sometimes reflecting back and repeating what someone has said to show that you've understood. But sometimes it can be just nodding, and if you're on the telephone where people can't see you nodding, that you're just making the right noises
mhm.
sometimes, and so people can see or hear that you are acknowledging what they're saying. We often hear about using good eye contact with people. Well, that can sometimes be a bit uncomfortable, particularly for someone who's neurodiverse, for example. So maybe just looking at them, but looking at their forehead or another point on their face, but not staring at them, because you think you should be paying full attention. It's quite a skill to develop, but just simply just acknowledging what's been said, I think is really important.
No, I think it's also such a powerful tool, right? To let people know that there is a safe space for them, that their stories matter and that their experiences matter. I think just validating people's experiences, whether it's about suicide loss, whether it's about any kind of mental health struggle as well, right? Just knowing that somebody understands or at least is trying to understand can make you feel a little less alone and a little less judged in those kind of situations.
Yeah, totally agree.
Steve, another huge part of the work that you're doing is around spreading awareness about suicide and sort of recognizing the signs of suicide. And I think, when you spoke about Jordan and Jordan's story, and I have heard, you share that story before as well. And I know you mentioned that, it for a lot of people, it came a bit as a shock, including for yourselves, that someone who you knew to be so outgoing, so friendly, someone who always checked in on other people, someone who was always there for other people would end up taking their own lives, or that, they were struggling to such a deep extent. But, can you share some of the warning signs of suicide, for people who are not aware about what suicidality, suicidal ideation could
Yeah,
look like?
yeah. Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I think just in positioning this, there are many circumstances that I've spoken to where there have been no signs of mental ill health from the individual, no signs of stress or strain, and suddenly that person has taken their own life, and people just cannot understand what has happened. And I think it's one of the reason why suicide is considered, and often I've heard the term suicide grief is like grief with the volume turned up, that it's different to any other kind of loss and grief. And the reason for that quite often is because there are so many unanswered questions. Why didn't we see that? And there's anger and there's blame and all kinds of emotions that are stirred up. But Jordan was diagnosed 4.5 years before his death with clinical anxiety and clinical depression. So he had a mental health illness, but he functioned in life, as I mentioned earlier. So although we were concerned that he had mental health illness and could fall into bouts of depression, and he managed that, some of that through medication and antidepressants, um, we didn't understand the risks. We didn't know that someone, and I didn't know, I was completely uneducated, that somebody who had a mental health illness um, was at risk of suicide. I now I say that now, and even now I go, "What, Steve? You really didn't understand that that might be a risk? Never even crossed my mind that that might be a consideration." But as I look back at Jordan particularly, and look at some of his behaviours and struggles, um, we look particularly during the most recent weeks prior to his death at how he struggled to sleep. Sleep deprivation was a real problem for him. I now know with an education that sleep deprivation is one of the biggest risk factors in terms of suicidal thoughts. Um, that I saw changes in his behavior where he would be more sensitive to criticism, perhaps. Now, he didn't fall into some of the other behaviors that, as far as I'm aware, of what we might consider risk-taking behaviors. He wasn't a heavy drinker at all. In fact, drank very little. He wasn't. He didn't take drugs. He wasn't into gambling. Any of the behaviors that sometimes people can use to suppress and deal with the emotions and feelings they have. Um, so he didn't fall into some of those categories, but he was certainly a very sensitive individual and showed more of those sensitivities towards the latter part of his life. So there were signs now that and when I deliver the talks, and sometimes I list some of the ways that people's thinking changes, that they often start reflecting on the past a lot and dwelling on the past. They might start to get their affairs in order. They might exhibit some of the behaviors that I've just mentioned a few moments ago that we saw from Jordan, but that could include overeating, it could include undereating, and other issues there. But what goes on in someone's mind, we often don't get to see. But we did, in fact, get to see that after Jordan's death. And one of the ways we got a better understanding of Jordan's thinking process was that a number of weeks after Jordan's death, as we were preparing Jordan's house for sale, we found a box of possessions in his attic. And within there were a number of notebooks. And in those notebooks, they were journals that he'd written, going back to the time around when he was first diagnosed with his clinical mental ill health. And although they were only partially written, they gave an insight into Jordan's thinking, how critical he was of decisions he made in his life around personal relationships, around the career moves that he'd made, around the houses that he bought, and very self-critical. And what we also saw, in fact, in 2015, in a journal entry in May of that year, was the first reference to researching methods of ending his own life. Now, we didn't know that that was Jordan's thought process. Why didn't we know? Because we never talked. about his mental health. We never really sat down and had that conversation because Jordan was independent. He lived on his own. Um, he didn't live that far away from myself. But when we got together, we would go for a beer or we go to the cinema or we go to watch a concert. And yes, I'd ask him how he was. But because we didn't get together every week, I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to be dad and not be the mental health interrogator.
Mhm.
I didn't want to say, look, before we go and have this pizza and a beer, can we sit down and talk about your mental health? Now, in hindsight, with the education that I now have, I would have had different conversations. There's no question about that. And that's not a blame or kind of a wish, if only. It is with the knowledge I have now. If Jordan had said, I've been struggling to sleep, or I saw maybe some very defensive behavior from him, I would stop now and I would go, okay, Jordan, look, this isn't kind of like you. But how are things? How are things really for you? Not just how are you? And then let's move on and go for a beer. So would that have opened up some of the conversations that he wrote about in his journal? Possibly. There's no guarantee for that. Um, but I think the reasons why I go out and raise awareness and deliver the talks is that there are almost always some signs. Not always, sometimes there are signs. And I think if we are better educated about how to spot those signs, and then importantly, how to have the conversation with someone to get them to talk about those signs or how they're feeling, we have a chance then to be there for them, which I think is really important.
I think, Steve, you touched upon something I was just going to come to, which is, if we notice the signs in someone who might be struggling, and you did mention that in hindsight, you felt that, now with the education that you do have, that perhaps you should have had a conversation, with Jordan to explore how he was feeling and how he was doing. But there is this general belief amongst people that if we talk to someone about suicide, we will put the idea into their head. And
Yes.
that's something I wanted to come to, that, how do people approach someone who they might be worried about? Because firstly, there's so much stigma around talking about it. You've written a report where you've referred to it as the S word, and we still do that. We're so very off talking about suicide that a lot of times we don't even want to use the word suicide. Like people will resort to euphemisms like, I hope you're not going to do something stupid, or I hope you're not going to do something silly with your life. Those kind of things. We don't want to even talk about it.
No, it's really important. And I was smiling really because we had this conversation yesterday on a course I was attending, and it's like, where did this myth come from that if you mention the word suicide, people will go, "Oh, thank you, that's a good idea." We don't even know where that came from, that myth, but it is a myth and it's been disproven. And I'm able to disprove it myself because I know the number of times that I've asked somebody very directly if they're considering suicide, um, that it's been a huge relief for them. It's the first time someone's actually mentioned the word. Um, and you're right that I deliver a talk that is titled "Navigating the S Word," and I was challenged by somebody who's very prominent in suicide prevention in the UK just recently, who saw the title of my talk and was almost quite angry that he said, we can't be hiding away from this word. I said, well, no, if you listen to my talk, we do talk about it, but I've very deliberately used that title because for some people listening today, they may be familiar with the fact that it isn't that long ago that when we talked about the physical illness of cancer, that was a taboo subject.
Mhm.
Everyone whispered, "Oh, they've got cancer." Um, so we called it the C word. We didn't, and now everyone is comfortable to talk about a cancer diagnosis or an illness, another traumatic experience in people's lives. So I deliberately use that title provocatively in the same way, but during the talk we openly talk about suicide. So in terms of approaching someone and having that conversation, I think if you have real concerns that there may be a risk of life. And the reason is because you've seen the symptoms that we've talked about, you've seen the changes in behavior, um, and you have heard enough and seen enough to feel that person is really in a helpless state. So if we understand what leads somebody to the point where they consider suicide as an option, it is usually that whatever culmination of events in their life or at that period of time have come together, that they feel so trapped in that situation that a sense of hopelessness now takes place. At that point, they see no other way out of the situation, and suicide becomes the option and the alternative to remove themselves from a pain that many of us just can't understand or comprehend. So, by asking that person if they are considering suicide directly at that point, you have a chance to open up a conversation and support them. And the conversation might be something that might just go like this as an example and say, "Look, Steve, I've noticed recently that you told me that you just haven't been able to sleep. You've been struggling to sleep, and this has been going on for weeks now. You mentioned you have a concern about your drinking heavily, and I can see all the empty bottles and in your recycling bin. I've never seen that before. You're also concerned about your work. You've told me. In fact, your boss has brought you in about your performance. You know, are these the things that are really worrying you? Well, yeah, they are. Okay. Well, sometimes when people have got themselves in this position, they start to have thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore. I need to ask you, are you having suicidal thoughts? Or are you considering ending your own life? Or are you considering suicide? And that's it. There's no skirting around the subject. My wife has just had this conversation with somebody in the last week. She doesn't do the work. She doesn't work with me at all. And she used that in almost exactly that way. And the person said, "Yes, I have." And you think, "Oh, that sounds quite easy." It's not easy. It's not an easy question to ask for anyone. I've had to ask it many times, but that is the way in which you would ask it. Now, just to add a caveat, if someone is just struggling a bit and having a bad few days and feeling a bit depressed, you're probably not going to go in and ask that question. But it's if you believe you have a real concern because of what you're experiencing or what you're hearing, then that would be the advice that I know from the training that I've received, and supported by many other people as well.
No, I think, even the little conversation that you crafted was really powerful, and it's just a reminder that sometimes we do feel it might be awkward to talk about suicide or be like, oh, what are they going to think of me if I ask them if they're thinking about it? But I think it's better to have that conversation than, later on live with that feeling that, oh my God, I should have just asked, if somebody does go on to take their own life. And it also somewhere ties into this notion where, sometimes when people do open up about suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation, we often tell them that they're being dramatic, attention seeking, this is not real. But when someone dies by suicide, suddenly we look at it as a tragedy. So, if we can all work towards supporting people who might be struggling or who are at risk, I think we can avoid being in situations where, we've seen that they've ended their own life or we've heard about any form of tragedy, whether it's been a suicidal attempt, whether it's been a suicide, any of it.
I think it's a really good point, and I think just coming back to something you mentioned about person seeking attention. Yes, they are. Yeah, they absolutely are seeking attention because they need help. So I think it's our responsibility to better understand why they're seeking that
Mm.
attention. And sometimes we just see them as attention seekers. If someone says, "Oh, I've had enough of all this," or I'm thinking of ending my own life, or someone is self-harming. There are people there that will see them as attention seekers. Okay, but if they are seeking attention, why? What is it about their life and their life experiences that is making them want to seek that attention? And I think that's why we need a kinder and more compassionate society. We need to stop and and say, well, okay, what is it that's happened that's causing you to behave or respond or feel this way? I'm listening. I want to understand. Um, and if you have that kind of conversation, that'll be probably the first time someone's ever stopped and really listened to someone. So I think you're absolutely right. It's really important.
I think you're very right as well. I think, sometimes when you do ask people, you would be surprised that you might be the only person who did ask. It's also
Yeah,
somehow almost a bystander effect. Sometimes you feel that it's okay, like if it's not me, somebody else will notice, somebody else will pick up on
yeah,
this, but you might be the only one who did.
yeah. And to add to what you said before, you don't want to be that person who decided not to have the conversation and then the tragedy happens.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and also coming back to attention seeking, personally, if you ask me, I think we put a lot of negative connotations to seeking attention, but it's not wrong. It's almost like a cry for help. And, maybe if we started looking at that as help seeking or support seeking or care seeking, we would probably be able to understand what people are experiencing better and just sort of help them not reach that crisis point almost.
Yeah, it's really good. And help seeking is a much nicer phrase than attention seeking, which has that negative connotation.
But we did talk about, one of the myths around suicide, which is that, in suicide prevention, particularly, that, if you talk to someone about it, you would put the idea into their mind. And of course, we don't know where that came from, but tragically, that is not the only myth or, misunderstanding that exists around suicide and also suicide prevention efforts. And, given that you've been in this space, you've been working so actively in it, you must have encountered many of these along the way.
Yes, I'm just trying to recount some of them now. I've probably had one of those head blank moments, but there are many. I mean, there are a dozen or more myths that are out there, and the obvious one that we've discussed. And yeah, one of the myths is that if someone is intent on taking their own life, you can't prevent it. There's nothing that you can do. We know that's not the case. I think it's really important to position the fact that all evidence and research suggests, in fact, that most suicides are preventable. Much of this understanding and research has come from people who have attempted to take their own lives, who have said that it wasn't that I wanted to die. I didn't want to die. I just could not continue to live as I was living. And that's a really important distinction to understand. So, armed with that knowledge, the next logical step is that most suicides are preventable then with the right interventions. So I think it's really important to recognize that although we can't prevent every single suicide, most of them we can do with the right intervention. So yeah, absolutely, that is a myth that has to be put to one side, that if someone's intent on ending their own life, there's nothing we can do. Complete myth.
I think also, the other thing that people don't realize about suicide and suicidal ideation or just suicidal behaviors is there is no look for feeling suicidal. Like, or we believe that certain people are high functioning. They seem to have it all together. They seem the least unlikely per se to, end their own life. So we believe, oh, they couldn't be thinking of this. But in reality, I think, the way you mentioned, for a lot of people, we don't know what they're going through. We don't know what they're experiencing. And somewhere, I think suicidality doesn't have a look. There is no prototype of a person who is more likely or less likely to end their lives. But so, I mean, based on what you said, I think we can say that, suicide can affect anybody, but anyone can help prevent suicide.
That's a perfect description, Vidika. Yes, and I think you're right that we hear the term quite often that suicide doesn't discriminate.
Mm.
That's not entirely true because we know there are sections of society where suicide is more prevalent. So we know that that's not factual really. But I think what people mean when they say that is, as you've rightly described, suicide can affect absolutely anyone. There's no visual expression. There's no, there's not a typical person that will end their own life by suicide. It can affect anyone. And in fact, some of the signs that we look out for, we talk about, people's behavior changing in a negative way or a deconstructive way. But sometimes we know that when people have had a prolonged period of depression, not feeling well, that they make the decision to end their own life by suicide, is that their mood lifts. They become much more upbeat. They become happier. And we've heard this many times. I'm sure you have, where people say, I can't understand it. She was on top of the world. She was really on good form. She was at a party last night. And what's important to understand, of course, is that suicide is often not something that's decided on the spur of the moment. It's often planned. We heard Jordan researching some 4.5 years before his death. Um, so at that point that someone has made the decision and committed to that decision, it's sometimes such a huge sense of relief for them. They're no longer going to experience this pain, that they become happier, both internally and externally, because they have the solution. And we've heard of people arranging parties for their friends and bringing them all together for one last party. The friends had no idea, but this person understood this would be the last time and was to their friends in the best possible frame of mind. So there is no stereotypical look or person that we would point to and go, they are or they are not
Mm.
having suicidal thoughts.
And that's really interesting, because especially when we hear about stories of individuals like Jordan who are very high functioning, who seemed to have it all put together, who seemed to be the life of every situation they were in. Or even when we hear about celebrity suicides, a lot of the conversation becomes, but oh, you'll pull up happy pictures of the individual and be like, they look like they had it all. They look like they were not going to do this. And I think it comes as a shock, but for all there have been signs which, people haven't been able to pick up on, no matter how nuanced it might have been.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really important that you mentioned there, particularly related to celebrities. But in the world of social media, we are all celebrities
Mm.
now, aren't we, within our own network? And we often present the best images of ourselves, the best videos of ourselves. And people see that side of us, and they see that regularly. So they assume that everything is okay. What we're not doing is paying attention to the times when they're not there. And I've just got an example of this. Just as you know, I do a tremendous amount on LinkedIn, and I've seen a post from somebody on LinkedIn who I know very well, who's done a lot of fundraising and been very active in um, the mental health and suicide prevention space. Um, and he just shared a post saying, "Sorry, I've been away for a while. I won't go into all the explanation why." And I suddenly went, "Gosh, I'd forgotten this person who was always there, who's always in my news feed every day. Yeah, I haven't seen him for 2 months." But we forget, we only pay attention when the person's there and shows up.
Mm.
What about when they don't show up? Why haven't they shown up? Are we so busy that we've kind of forgotten about them? And I think in this case, yes, I was. So I think it's really, really interesting that we see this face of people, we believe everything's okay, but we don't look at the more subtle, nuanced signs.
I think you're right, because in a social media world, I think the way people show up has changed. And just to sort of check in on people, for instance, if someone has been regular on social media in terms of sharing content and they just sort of disappear per se from social media, that could also be a sign, especially in a modern technology, digital driven age, right?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. And it's yeah, so that was a lesson for me this morning. That was interesting.
I know, Steve, one of the things that you've been working tirelessly towards is to build a zero suicide society. And I think all of us as individuals, no matter what we do, no matter where we come from, have a role to play in that. Because, like we spoke about it earlier, people who die by suicide are not just numbers. they're real people who matter to a lot of people. And for the people left behind and sort of bereaved, they're not just, the 1 in 40 seconds, person who ended their life. So when we talk about a zero suicide society, what does that sort of look like to you, and what do you think we can all do to help towards that goal?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important definition that we need to brief explanation about, because automatically when people hear the term zero suicide, we assume that it's a target to prevent every single suicide in the world. And as we've already said, we know we can't prevent every single suicide, but it is an aspiration and it's a philosophy, and it's based on evidence, particularly out of Detroit and the Henry Ford healthcare system there from the early 2000s, where they successfully, through a very collaborative project, including with people with lived experience, managed to reduce suicides within that healthcare system to zero in one particular year, where they were experiencing deaths within that healthcare system by suicide up until that point. So it's a philosophy, it's a framework, and it's really predicated on a belief that says if we were going to have a target to prevent suicide, what should we be aiming for? And if someone says 10%, someone's automatically going to say, well, what about the other 90%? If someone says 50%, we go, well, what about the other 50%? There'll always be, why are we not trying to prevent all suicides? Because by aiming to prevent all, we stand a chance of preventing far more. And that's where the term zero suicide comes from. And I think it's really about how we operate in our societies generally. You already explained and used the term that anyone can prevent suicides, and anyone can. Anyone can go and get an education today. They can go on the zerosuicidealliance.org website in the UK, and they can take a 20-minute learning course on video in their lunchtime. That one video alone would provide enough knowledge for someone to be able to have a conversation that afternoon if they needed it, how to spot the signs, how to have a conversation and support someone. So anyone can do this. But in a zero suicide world, where a zero suicide society is, in our belief and our definition, one that is willing and able to do all it can to prevent all preventable suicides, we can start to look at how we do this within our schools, how we do this within our workplaces, how we do this within our community settings, within our football clubs, within our sports teams, within our local council offices and governments, through our technology, through our construction industries. We can start to say, what are we doing within those environments to really mitigate the risk of a suicide happening? Because if you went to any school, small school, large school, any school, or you went to any business and just asked them a question and said, what do you believe is an acceptable number of suicides within your school or your business? I think that head teacher or that business owner or HR director would go, well, none. Okay, so you believe zero should be the aspiration for your school then?
Mm.
Yeah, we wouldn't want anyone to take their life. Okay, so what are you doing to ensure that that is the case? And when you have that conversation at a micro level, but then add all those micro conversations together and get every school and every workplace to have that attitude, then you start moving closer toward a zero suicide society. So it's not one big goal or one big project or one big government initiative that'll do that. It's lots and lots of micro actions coming together to make us move closer towards that zero suicide society.
No, I think that really talks about also, the power of little steps and the power that we all have as individuals to make a change. And, just like having these kind of conversations, the work that you're doing, I think it really helps to sensitize people, but also get people more aware, right? Whether it's about talking about suicide, whether it's also a conversation about mental health, especially for men, because so many times the stigma sort of prevents men from talking about suicide, and they are often at a higher risk because of that, because they feel alone, they feel not supported. And of course, the whole societal pressure and the gender norms that exist around men and masculinity per se. And Steve, just to wrap up everything that we spoke about today, and I know we touched upon a lot of themes. And once again, I'm very thankful for you to be here and for the work that you're doing. And of course, for continuing to spread Jordan's legacy and, now taking it to different parts of the world as well. If you could give any piece of advice to somebody who's, listening to this or watching this, who might be struggling with their mental health right now, or might be struggling with feelings of suicide, or, just feeling that sense of despair, what would that be?
I think the first thing we use the word hope a lot, and we know that for anyone who is considering suicide, they're getting very close to a sense of having no hope or have lost all hope. And I think the message is really important, and it's a practical message of hope, because it's not enough to say just have hope. Okay, just, be hopeful. That's I've lost all hope. How can you tell me just to be hopeful? But I think what we can say is we now know for a fact that no matter how bad things have become, no matter how low you've become, we have met enough people now who were in the same position as you, who had lost all hope, who through the intervention, through the right support, through something just changing in their lives dramatically, that these people that felt the same as you have gone on to lead lives, and good lives, where they've been able to contribute, where they've been able to have more hope and see light at the end of the tunnel. So I think the important message is try and stay another day. Really important. If no one is reaching out to you, reach out and find that help. It will be available. Find someone and tell them how you are feeling. You will be surprised at how often you will get a sympathetic ear and somebody with empathy that will support you and help you. Sometimes we've got to reach out when we're struggling, but to everyone else listening, sometimes you've got to reach in and be that support for that person.
No, thank you so, so much, Steve. I think, you took the words from me, and those, as our parting words. But I really, really appreciate, that you took out time for this conversation today. And, for our viewers, for our listeners, even as Steve reiterated, just know that if you are having a hard time with your mental health, there is always, always hope out there, and things do get better. So please reach out for help if you need it, knowing that there is always that chance that things will improve and you can turn things around for yourself. So don't give up. Remember that you are not alone and things do get better. So till next time, please stay well and stay healthy. Thank you.